All right, good afternoon. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Happy Thursday. I think that's what today is. Yes, it's Thursday. It's my last week in the office, and so I'm not sure what day it is. But good afternoon and happy Thursday to each of you. I see you coming in the room, and we're very happy that you decided to join us on this Thursday afternoon. Thank you for joining us. While we're waiting for our other friends to join, we ask that you would use the chat function to share a little bit about yourself. So give us your name, your current role, and where you're streaming from. And we also want to know what brings you here today. So we kind of want you to think about, what are you hoping to learn? What can you contribute to the conversation? What do you hope to take away from this gathering? So feel free to put that stuff in the chat while we wait on some of our other friends to join. Let's see. Let me get to the chat and look at some stuff. All right. Oh, we got Sarah. Okay. Please do let us know who you are, where you're coming from. Welcome, Stacy. Welcome, Stacy. All right. Hello, Kelly. Dallas College, Richland. Wonderful. Hey, I'm very familiar with JCSGA, so we are in the house. I was region 5 in the day. Hey, Emma, fellow YIer. All right, I see them coming in. So glad they're coming in. Keep them coming in. Keep them coming in. Definitely want to quickly welcome you to this afternoon session. I am Greg Norwood. I currently serve as the Southern Engagement Manager for Young Invincibles. We're so very glad to have partnered with Commit and Ed Trust to put on this conversation. I think this is going to be very, very helpful. Today's session is a collaboration of the Education Trust in Texas, the Commit Partnership, and Young Invincibles. I just want to quickly thank the team that has helped coordinate and prepare for this session. It really is. It's really going to be a great session. Before we get started, we would like to share a few operational and orienting notes. You can definitely turn the live screen transcript on or off using the Zoom function. We will be recording this afternoon's call, so you will be able to revisit this conversation at a later date. We have organized our time together with 3 main goals in mind: to help you get up-to-date speed on the formation, membership, and progress of the Texas Commission on Community College Finance, to view and react to key information from the most recent meeting of the Commission, and to share a few resources and future opportunities to follow and participate moving forward.
Great, thank you, Greg. Welcome again to everybody who's joining. My name is Jonathan Feinstein. I serve as the Texas State Director for the Education Trust, and really excited about our time together, which is going to be pretty ambitious. We're going to try and consolidate 4 to 5 hours of Monday's second meeting of the Texas Commission on Community College Finance. I know that's a mouthful, so you'll see TCCC, I think I said that F multiple times, is the abbreviation for the commission. But I think, briefly, we will provide some background on the commission, but I wanted to just start by saying that it's important to know that this appointed group is really just in the early stages, and that they will be serving through November of next year, through November of 2022. So that seems like a long time, but I know that the process will probably go quickly, and today is really just the beginning of a lengthy process, both for the members, but certainly for us as advocates and members of the Texas community as well. So we're not going to be able to answer every question because of our limited time, and because in some ways it's impossible to know exactly how the commission will proceed in its work. we're getting a better idea of that, and we're going to use this space to make sure that anybody who wants to stay informed and engaged in the process along the way has the opportunity to do so. So again, this recap event is really meant as a starting point for us to see the commission in action, for you to ask questions. We definitely want you. There is no bad questions at all today. A lot of us are learning about how community colleges in Texas are funded, for some of us for the first time. So please engage in the chat. We've got some great experts and folks who've been learning a little bit before us to help answer them, and definitely participate. We're going to have some questions and invite your feedback and responses to some of what we hear as we watch some specific highlights and themes from the most recent meeting. So before we go any further, Devon, I think this is where I'd love for us to put the poll up if it isn't already available to our members. Hopefully you're chiming in on the chat, but we just want to better learn about those of you who are joining. I think we have coming close to 40 participants who are joining today. We just want to know which of these kind of best describes you. Are you a current or former community college student, or a former or current member of a community college faculty or staff, or something else entirely? So let us know that. And then I think our second question is, we just want to level set a little bit on the background knowledge you're bringing to today. So how would you rate your current understanding of community college finance in Texas? So 1 would be a novice, or this is the first time I'm going to have the chance to learn about it, all the way up to 5, which is I'm an expert. I've been studying this for years. I know the formula. I know success points details and contact hours, which we'll talk about in just a minute. So let us know also, if you could, from that 1 to 5 scale. And as folks complete, I know Devon will make sure we get a chance to see those results. But the major thing I just want folks to take away as we pivot into the agenda is that you are in the driver's seat. This is a beginning. You're likely going to need additional resources, which we'll try to provide. And we really encourage you to follow the progress of the commission as you continue to round out your understanding of its work and about community colleges. So again, thanks to everybody for joining. At this point, we're going to keep things moving in the agenda and hand it off to Stephanie.
Thank you, Jonathan. So I'm Stephanie Murphy. I'm the Director of Education Policy at the Commit Partnership. And before we jump into highlights from Monday's meeting, I kind of thought we would take a step back and briefly provide some background on the commission. So as Jonathan mentioned throughout the session, please do chat your questions into the box, and we will either try to answer them directly in the chat or flag them for discussion. So just keep those questions coming. Like Jonathan said, there's no bad questions. So if there's something that you're dying to ask, chat it in at any point. So the commission was established by the Texas legislature during this past session through SB 1230, and it was authored by Senator Larry Taylor and was sponsored on the House side by Representative Leo Pacheco. And the commission is essentially charged with making recommendations for consideration by the next legislature to, quote, establish a state funding formula and funding levels sufficient for sustaining viable community college education and training offerings throughout the state. It called the bill SB 1230 that established the commission calls for a commission of 12 members that were appointed by the governor, lieutenant governor, speaker of the House, Texas Association of Community Colleges, and the Community College Association of Texas Trustees. The commission met for the first time on November 15th at the Capitol in Austin, which is where I'm currently based. This first meeting ran for about 4 hours from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. And featured invited testimony from several state agencies, including the Higher Education Coordinating Board and the Workforce Commission. And it was essentially a level setting event to get everyone oriented. Jonathan, if we could get to the slide on the key takeaways. Well, I guess first, here are the commission members. Here's half of them. Woody Hunt is the chair. Todd Williams is the CEO of Commit. He's my boss, so he's on the commission as well. I think we've got another slide of commission members. The other commission members, so we've got legislative members, we've got leaders of community colleges represented, as well as businesses represented. So a quick snapshot of who our community colleges serve, just because I don't think that everyone always knows this. But in fall 2021, enrollment of new and returning students at our community colleges was just over 650,000 students. It is down from the previous year, but 650,000. 46% of those students were Hispanic, 31% were white, 12% Black, 5% were Asian, and then 4% were other, and 2% of those students were international. The gender breakdown of the student population at our community colleges, 60% female, 40% male. I know that female enrollment declined during COVID, but they still comprise a majority of the community college student population. In terms of the breakdown between full-time and part-time enrollment, among all students, only 22% are full-time, 78% are part-time. So it's a huge difference between the attendance at community colleges and the four-year institutions. And then for first-time enrollees, nearly half were Pell recipients. And that figure is generally taken as a proxy for low income. So almost half of our community college students received a Pell Grant. So a brief overview and a very, very simple 101 on how Texas community colleges are funded. You may often hear the funding for community colleges referred to as a three-legged stool. There are essentially three main buckets of funding. Community colleges get funding from local property taxes, they get funding from student tuition that's paid to them, and then they get a portion of their funding from the state itself through state appropriations. And here you can see a little bit more detail about those three legs of the stool. In terms of tuition and fees, community colleges charge both in-district and out-of-district rates, depending on if a student is within a taxed district or outside of it. And the tuition and fee rates differ pretty significantly across the community colleges in our state. Other states across the country have a set rate. Ours does not. So community colleges, all 50 systems charge, there are essentially 50 different rates. In terms of property taxes, these vary by region significantly and by property valuation. And in order to receive property taxes, voters in an area must opt in to pay for this. So this becomes a challenge when community colleges want to either increase their taxes or expand their taxed area. Voters have to agree to be able to be taxed. In terms of the state appropriation piece, which is also referred to as the formula funding piece, there are three subcomponents to that. The first is called core operations, and in the most recent biennium, $1.4 million was granted for every community college district. So each of the 50 districts got 1.4 million, regardless of size, enrollment. It was a blanket 1.4 million per community college district, and core operations was introduced in order to support the smaller, more rural institutions so that they got kind of a fair share of the state appropriations pie. Then we have contact hours. After core operations are funded, 89.4% of the remaining state appropriation funds support contact hours. And this money reflects enrollment, and it allocates money for each hour of academic instruction given. And it's based on the cost of providing that education. So some programs, some courses cost more to deliver than others. And so the contact hour funds reflect that variation in cost. And then finally, under the state appropriations piece, we've got student success points, which is our state's outcomes-based or performance-based funding model. After the core operations are taken out, 10.6% of the state's funds are awarded through student success points. And essentially, community colleges earn points for students' completion of 11 milestones across a spectrum. The point weights vary by each metric along the 11 milestones. And each point's dollar value also changes each biennium. Essentially, the legislature backs into it. They come in seeing how much money they have. And then once they figure out the appropriations piece, then they calculate the value of each point. So it varies each biennium. Here's a quick snapshot of the service area versus taxing district piece that I was mentioning earlier. So the map on the left shows the 50 different service areas for the 50 community college districts. So each little colored section is an area serviced by a separate community college. And then on the right, each colored box represents a district that is taxed. As you can see, there is a pretty large discrepancy between the districts that are taxed and the areas that are serviced. And essentially the taxed districts are the ones paying for the services that the community colleges provide in their service area. So the white areas are the areas that receive service from community colleges but don't pay in with any sort of property tax. Here's a snapshot of the success point milestones. I won't review them. You can find them various places online, but just shows you quickly, what's included on that milestone list: college readiness, completion of college level courses, earning certain number of credit hours, production of a degree or certificate, completion of a degree or certificate in critical fields, which are worth more than general degrees or certificates. And then points are also awarded for students who transfer from a community college to a four-year institution after having accrued a certain number of credit hours. And finally, a recap from the November 15th meeting that I mentioned just a few minutes ago. The commission heard from a number of speakers. The commissioner emphasized the fact that community college enrollment is down in fall 2021 by 11%, which equates to 85,000 students compared to fall 2019. Community college enrollment has been declining since 2011, and we've seen the largest declines at the largest urban colleges. The Workforce Commission emphasized the skills mismatch that exists in our state. 54% of jobs in Texas are considered middle skill, meaning that they require a post-secondary education beyond high school, but less than a bachelor's degree. So 54% of jobs require that level of credentialing. However, only 45% of Texans are sufficiently trained for these jobs, leaving a 9 percentage point, essentially middle skills gap that consists of 1.4 million Texans. We also heard from a demographer that talked about the fertility rates in our state. They've been declining since the Great Recession, especially among our Hispanic residents. Each age cohort has become progressively smaller, and the demographers stress that if this downward trend sustains, it could have a negative long-term effect on college enrollment. In terms of next steps for the commission, they did meet this past Monday. Then they'll meet again as a full group in January. And then after that January meeting, the commission will be divided into 3 different subgroups by topic area, so that they can do a deeper dive on institutions, on workforce and employer engagement, and then finally on student supports and success. And with that,
Excellent.
I think I turn it back over to you, Jonathan.
Yeah, and I'm glad to see Ruby in the chat, asking questions. She asks, why has community college enrollment declined? Is that a result of the pandemic? I don't know if anybody wants to tackle that question, and maybe Sarah in the chat if you want to, or quickly if anyone wants to come off mute to kind of share that.
I can jump in quickly and just say what I've heard from the commissioner, because he presented when he initially presented the fall 2021 enrollment data, he got this very same question and he didn't have an answer for it yet. They're still looking into it. The biggest declines were also among returning students, and there's a concern that with the life challenges that community colleges students tend to face more so than students at our four-year institutions, that juggling life became too difficult to juggle alongside earning a post-secondary credential. A lot of the like I mentioned earlier, women were also among the sharpest declining population, and there's speculation there that with women being typically the primary caregiver and children having to stay home to take courses virtually at school, women just had to drop out of the post-secondary pipeline to stay home and take care of the family, take care of household responsibilities. So that's the speculation that the commissioner was willing to provide. But if anybody else has any additional thoughts, we would definitely welcome those.
I see some more folks adding their expertise in the chat, but and I think we will hear that theme that Stephanie just talked about, and then I see Anna Mays in the chat mentioning. So we'll dive more into these themes for sure. And thanks again for everybody engaging actively in the chat. I'm gonna go ahead and share those poll results from earlier, just so all of us can kind of see who we're with today. And I know we've continued to have people join us, so welcome. But we've got I'd say a broad diversity of different perspectives that are joining us today, and we hope to engage in that way. And then of course we have looks like folks across the spectrum, which is great. We have some folks who consider themselves experts, and many who readily admit that they are novices and are learning about community college finance for the first time. So it's a great community to be in, to share that knowledge and information with the time we have. So what we're going to do now, and I'm going to try to skillfully juggle between slides and highlights, but here's the agenda. So the rest of today is really about sinking our teeth into Monday's most recent commission meeting. And you can see the agenda here on your screen. These were all kind of invited testimony. We will only be able to share a few highlights from among the people who you see listed. So we will play a clip from Dr. Harrison Keller, who's the commissioner of the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board. We'll play a clip from Dr. Joe May, the chancellor of Dallas College. I believe we will then jump, because I think it was in the order of the actual, the order of the day did not match the agenda. We'll hear some remarks and some data from Todd Williams, as well as Dr. Sarah Goldrick-Robb, who some of you may be familiar with as a national expert who was invited to testify. For those of you who want to find all of these materials, including the full archive video, all of the presentation slides, the coordinating board, and thank you, Sarah, in the chat, has provided this link so that you can go to it now or later, but definitely want to recognize the coordinating board's done a great job with transparency, getting these materials up in a very quick turnaround. So with that, if I can figure out how to take the poll off my screen. There we go. I am going to bring up our first highlight, actually. Sorry, y'all. This is trying to do too much. One second. So I'm going to bring up this first highlight, and you'll have to kind of bear with me. You can take a look at this highlight, but Dr. Keller, I'm going to play a little clip of what he shared, did, I think, a really good job at the outset of defining some of the key differences that exist between how we fund our Texas public schools and how we fund higher education. So I recognize that some on our call may be more familiar with school finance on the K-12 side and less with higher ed. So these are important distinctions that have a lot to do with the boundaries and some of the challenges that the commission will be trying to address through their work. So I'm going to stop sharing this and allow you to watch some of the actual clip of Dr. Keller. And I think I've got the right timestamp here.
Legislature added a requirement that the institutions have to report to us about how they're using these federal funds. They're making those first reports now. So early in the new year, we should have a richer set of data to share with the commission about how colleges are using these funds. And finally, on slide 8, I did want to highlight some key differences between our public school finance system and the higher education finance system. So as you know, this commission was inspired by the work and the success of the Texas Commission on Public School Finance from 2017. And that school finance commission was tasked with reforming the K-12 finance system. And of course, its recommendations were largely adopted in 2019 via House Bill 3. So while the objectives of that commission, this commission, have a good deal of overlap, there's some key differences between the systems that the commission will likely want to consider. Most notably, public education funding is an entitlement under the Texas Constitution, whereas public higher education funding is not. So the higher education formulas are used to allocate available funding that's appropriated for higher education, but it does not automatically drive additional funding in the system. So there are a number of different features of the public school finance system. For example, sometimes there have been discussions about potential for Robin Hood recapture. The constitutional provisions around providing an efficient system of public school finance sets the context for the legislature's deliberations about recapture, whereas our preliminary assessment that a similar kind of Robin Hood provision on the community college side would probably be unconstitutional. And second, under the K-12 system, a school district's local property tax revenue is considered in the context of the state funding formulas as a method of finance for school district entitlements, whereas the community college formulas, the state formulas, don't consider either the local property tax effort or tuition. So it just drives that state allocation to the colleges. So next, the school district funding is adjusted based on multiple student and district characteristics, especially student socioeconomic status, special education services, students who have limited English proficiency, and also some geographic factors. Community college enrollments are, community college formulas are just based on enrollments and student success points without any adjustments for student needs. So essentially, as a student is a student is a student. And then finally, the K-12 system includes a settle up process at the end of each fiscal year to reconcile school district state aid payments that are based on their estimated attendance and their tax earning and their tax revenues to their actual earnings. So our higher education community college finance formulas on the other side use a base year to determine state appropriations. And if there's a lag, that lag is not reconciled. So there's
So there was a lot there in a lot of jargon, but I do want to pause here because I think this is a really important opportunity to get clear, to ask questions about just kind of the fundamentals of how higher ed overall, but community colleges in particular are funded in Texas. So I know that maybe Sarah's in the chat here, but I'm curious if anyone has any clarifying questions about what was just said, because it is really important just to understand a couple of the key things, right? Which is that as Stephanie said earlier, this allocation methodology means that the formula really just scales up or down based on how much the legislature actually appropriates. And also this point about local funding. Stephanie showed the map earlier about how much geography is not taxed at the local level for property taxes. And what Harrison Keller was saying there was that by their assessment, there isn't a mechanism within the state constitution to reallocate local property tax values the way that we do through what's called Robin Hood in K-12. And I think maybe the most important thing would be this statement that any parts of the formula, and Stephanie shared that three-legged stool and the state appropriation side in particular, don't have any weights to them. There are no differentiators in terms of the demographics of the students that are enrolled or served by the various community college districts. So I'll pause there, but we can keep moving. But I wanted to make sure we played this highlight, especially for folks who maybe don't have some of this background knowledge about the system itself. All right. One thing maybe to think about, and if you have an opinion in the chat, would be of these, I guess, differences, which one do you think is most important for the commission to try to address and why? So is it increasing the state's allocation? Is it incentivizing somehow more of these local taxing districts to pay into their service areas? Is it adjusting the formulas that they do have to recognize varying student needs? Or is it adjusting these payouts to address that lag, which was the last point? So if you have opinions, if there's a way to prioritize those, would definitely be interested if folks have an opinion. But I'm going to move us forward to Stephanie on highlight number 2 from Monday's meeting.
All right, and this is from Dr. Joe May of Dallas College, and he is talking about the changes in state funding over the past 4 decades.
Really? You began to see what is almost an imperceptible shift on an annual basis, 1%, 2% along the way, as we began to see a shift away from state as an overall percentage of institutional funding at community colleges, to that being made up primarily by tuition and then local tax revenue to offset that as we've gone forward. And, you know, we often talk about community colleges. I've been around a long time at this, the three-legged funding stool, state, local, and student, as kind of being a third, a third, a third. Well, actually, the only year that we kind of hit that would have been 2005. If you look at the graph when statewide, it did kind of break up a third, a third, a third. And if I had 2021 data, it would show, I believe this year about around 24% is actually the state funding percentage. So we continue to see that erosion in terms of the overall budget. Next slide. So you'll also, which makes sense if you look at this, when I mentioned that in 2005, it was about a third, which is roughly about the time that we see that state funding crossed local taxes and tuition as the primary revenue sources that, and then we see that shift continue with most of the burden across the state being shifted to local taxes. Now, I won't use many Dallas examples, but frankly, that's been pretty intentional at Dallas. We've not issued a tuition increase in 7 years. And the only way that's possible in our case is if we were offsetting that with some of the revenue, in this case, local taxes. So that's been the struggle. But again, I go back to business models. Every college can choose to do that differently. Some may choose to increase tuition and lower taxes. There's an infinite number of possibilities in terms of how that could be handled. But at the end of the day, the drivers will be determined locally, but obviously reacting somewhat to what is happening on the state allocation primarily.
All right, so essentially Dr. May is talking about the three-legged stool that I mentioned earlier of community college funding, the state appropriations, the tax money, and the tuition money that comes from students. And turns out that the three-legged stool, each leg of the stool is not equal in size. The last time that they were relatively equal, as Dr. May mentioned, was back in 2005. And really ever since then, the state appropriations leg of the stool has stayed the same. And then the other two legs of the stool have gotten bigger and bigger and bigger, so that taxpayers and students have had to take on an increasing share of the cost of community college. So question that I want to throw out for the group and get everyone's thoughts on is, over time, as community colleges have responded to stagnant state funding by having to either seek to increase local taxes or increase their tuition, how have you experienced or witnessed the consequences of these choices in your own community? And feel free to either chat it in the box or unmute yourself and speak up.
Or if you have a question. Yeah, oh, go ahead, please.
I was just going to say, it's easier for me to just say it than it is to type it. I have noticed, I've been in the district since 2012, so almost 10 years I've been in Dallas College. I've noticed that our high school dual credit P-Tech students have massively increased, and our students that are just, I finished high school and now I'm going to college, have gone down because I don't understand all the financing. Obviously, I'm the low man on the totem pole, but to me, it seems like those high school students are the low hanging fruit, because they're getting the share from the school districts. They're getting, it's like automatic almost. So like parking is not a problem anymore because all the students come on school buses.
All right, and in the chat, we've got a couple of comments that were made. One from Paul Colbert: the legs were not originally supposed to be equal. The original structure was that the state paid for all operating costs with some assistance from tuition, and local taxes would pay for facilities. That got redefined beginning in 2003. And then Christopher from DeVry says that he has seen a greater emphasis on completing college credits in high school to help defray completion costs. I see Kelly nodding. All right, any other thoughts on the stagnating state appropriations piece?
I mean, I'll just say, we didn't show the slide but it is in there in Dr. May's deck, which is, effectively what I think he also wanted to make sure to point out is that, and he did say it, but that means that the cost of college can vary widely from district to district or even student to student. And we'll dig into a little bit of that in a second with some data in the next clip. But part of what that means is, one, if you are a resident in a non-taxing district, right, that means you're going to be paying more than a resident in the very same, who enrolled in the very same institution, who is a resident in the taxing district. So there's variable tuition rates for students who live who are attending the same district, who live in the same service area. And Jennifer's saying that is also true for dual credit. So that may be true of a high school student as well. And I think the other thing that means is that across the state, that there may be a lower property tax rate because of some of the decisions that those non-taxing entities have made, and that is going to be offset by enrollment and therefore by tuition. And so that just means that we have, as Dr. May said, 50 different business models that, while vary widely, really between two pieces, not the state funding as much as it is between, again, reliance on enrollment and tuition, or upon that local tax base.
I just want to say why dual credit enrollment may be increasing. I know it's about 30% of Dallas College enrollment. One of the reasons is many of the larger cities have a relatively high poverty rate. In Dallas, the city of Dallas is at 20 to 25% of the adults are below poverty, and the children are even at a higher rate of poverty. And what we have found is students, particularly from high schools that are in those low income areas, have higher education rates of less than 15% over a 6-year period of time, meaning once they graduate from high school, they go into low wage jobs. They never return to college, or if they start college, they don't complete. And so Dr. May has been very instrumental in our area in increasing the early college, high schools, and PTEX, because we have a higher graduation rate, obviously, of the students who can complete college while they're still in high school, or at least attain some of the courses that they need to transfer to universities, which reduces their cost. Student debt, as you know, has been rising. There have been a lot of books lately about that. And with our adults, what we're finding is that many of the adult students who started college and never completed have student debt, owe financial aid, and that is a barrier to their return to college. So college being affordable is very much an issue. And I don't think the state really has recognized it holistically. There have been counties like Dallas that have initiated Promise or other funding to support students, but Texas as a whole has not really addressed the issue.
Well, I think you're segueing us nicely into the last two clips and points that we wanted to lift up with our time together. And there are a couple of graphs here, but without having to read in a lot of detail, what we're going to hear next is kind of an overview of this data that really explains the correlation or really the lack thereof between the poverty of students feeding into our community colleges and the tuition rates that they are more than likely paying, as well as some information about how those tuition rates, the higher they get, or the more reliant, I should say, that the community college is on tuition, generally the trend that they get on outcomes. So I am going to again move us over to this screen, and I'm going to have to skip all the way to a segment here, and this is going to be Todd Williams presenting some of that data that you just saw on your screen.
Community college system does it feed into? And what is the economic disadvantage of that feeder K through 12 system? And what we show is that as you go left to right and you get to increasingly poor feeder systems, the average tuition rate that is charged for 30 credit hours actually increases. You would think that as you get increasingly poor in terms of the students that are coming into the system, that you would hope that tuition would be lower. And in fact, it is higher. And it's not surprisingly because the more increasing poverty within a community, the lower property values, and so therefore the lower revenues. And if the state contribution is relatively fixed, the burden is borne by the student's tuition to cover the gap for the total institutional revenue. And so the next slide is we said, okay, well, let's look at what is the percentage of revenue for community colleges that is represented by tuition. And what we saw is that as you get increasingly dependent on tuition, which is you go from left to right along the axis, your 3-year completion rates for community colleges goes down, which is, again, isn't surprising. Higher tuition, lower completion rates because kids stop out.
So again, you can see here on the screen, hopefully, the slides that are being referenced here. So again, this just shows, kind of based on the x-axis, the percentage of we call economically disadvantaged, or students from low-income backgrounds in the districts that school districts, K-12 districts that feed into the community college. And then on the y-axis, kind of the tuition and fee cost on the Y, and you can kind of see that as those student demographics get poorer, the cost of tuition generally goes up. There are outliers, so you should note some of those on there as well. And then the last point that was made, right, was that as that percent of community college revenues that are dependent on tuition and fees increase, you can see this is the 3-year graduation rate, kind of a slight but still visible decline in completion rates. So I think the question we want to ask here before moving to the final clip is, how have you experienced or witnessed, the impact of tuition costs on students' ability to successfully complete community college, especially students from low-income backgrounds, and maybe where is that underinvestment kind of most evident? I should say this does kind of feed us into the last segment. But while you think about that question, I really do want to play one last clip from Todd Williams's testimony, because I think it puts a lot of this conversation about finance more broadly into perspective. And so I'm going to skip ahead to that. But again, I want us to really be thinking about for students growing up in low-income backgrounds, when they face kind of these slightly higher tuition costs, what the impact might be. And again, I heard Anna maybe saying this, which is part of the reaction is we're seeing the dual credit spike, which is students accruing kind of these college credits while they're still in high school and not having to pay for that full cost of tuition in some cases. So I am going to skip ahead, but I do want to play this because I thought this was a powerful framing.
Kids, and to be able to have data that tracks and allows us to continuously improve, but also reconnect with kids who become disconnected from the system. So I'll close with 2 slides. Next slide, if you don't mind. One more. So this slide on the right just shows spending in the K through 12 system. It's hard to read, so I'll tell you what it says. It says that today, in 2019, we're spending about $12,200 per student in pre-K through 12 system. Multiply that times the number of grades, and that means we're investing about $160,000 of state funding, local funding, to basically educate our kids in pre-K through 12. But 30, 40 years ago, when this community college system, funding system was established, only 28% of degrees required a post-secondary education. Now we know that 65 to, depending on how you define it, 65 to 90% of new jobs require some type of post-secondary education. So it's that last mile we're talking about. And if we're spending $160,000 in the pre-K through 12 system as a state, and only 1 in 4 students is completing a post-secondary education within 6 years following high school graduation, that is not a great ROI on our system. Use an analogy, we would not spend $160,000 to build a house and then only 1 of every 4 roofs worked and didn't leak. And so I think one of the things that we think about is that, state resources are always precious. And I'm a huge believer, and we believed it in the K through 12 Commission, that you don't solve problems by throwing money at it. But there are going to be, and I suspect that we will find over the next several months, several strategies that, if enacted and funded adequately, could make a meaningful difference in making sure that our taxpayers in Texas get a return on that 160 investment in pre-K through 12.
So I don't have that matching slide, but again, I think the analogy there is very useful for us to keep in mind as we think about what the requirements that we just heard in terms of the labor market and what jobs require these days compared to the last time we really significantly took a look at our community college funding system, as well as kind of that kind of last mile, or how are we kind of doubling down on the investments that we're making in our K-12 system. Stephanie, I'm going to pass it back to you for our last but really powerful highlight that came from Dr. Sarah Goldrick-Robb.
Sounds good. Do you want me to talk about it first, or do you want to play it first?
You can talk about it while I get to the right clip.
All right. So Dr. Sarah Goldrick-Robb, for those of you who don't know her, she is a professor at Temple, and she is the founder of the Hope Lab that conducts research on what they refer to as the hashtag Real College Student. So all the students who comprise a larger and larger proportion of the post-secondary student population, but are different from what we consider the traditional students. So they do a lot of work on basic needs insecurity, homelessness, and the different kinds of services that community college students typically need, and the linkage of providing these supports to students and outcomes in student success.
State, and you can see the 10 participating Texas community colleges that did our survey. I do want to acknowledge.
Let me rewind that just briefly, because I think I might have cut her off.
To very expensive colleges, places like Rice or places like Stanford or Harvard, they don't need to offer as much in the way of emergency aid because a relatively small fraction of students will ever need it. But at your community colleges, the vast majority of students will require that help while in school. Now, in 2020, in the height of the pandemic, was the latest survey that we fielded among community college students throughout your state. And you can see the 10 participating Texas community colleges that did our survey. I do want to acknowledge that some other institutions are collecting the kinds of data that we collect, but they're doing so with Trellis. And so that's another instrument that can be used. It is very important that these sorts of data are collected and closely examined if you are to make most efficient use of your dollars. You want to know, for example, year over year, whether institutions are in fact making affordability gains, and whether, for example, when students need emergency aid, if they're able to access it. The last time that we fielded this survey, you can see that 2/3 of the students at your Texas community colleges were experiencing some form of basic needs insecurity, which, as you can see, typically means either food and or housing insecurity. Housing insecurity are the kinds of things like challenges paying rent or challenges paying utility bills that can precipitate homelessness, a problem that becomes even more detrimental to students and more expensive. We saw that 16% of your Texas community college students surveyed were experiencing homelessness, the vast majority of whom were couch surfing. Now, couch surfing might not sound as bad as sleeping on the street, but the fact is, most people who are couch surfing are guests in someone else's home, but not really treated like guests. Many of them are not allowed to turn on the lights, they're not allowed to open the refrigerator, and they're only allowed to sleep there at night. So it's a very stressful situation that does not actually promote academic success. Now, these are also equity gaps, as I noted earlier. So for example, here are the data disaggregated by race ethnicity. We can see that the Black-white gap in the odds of dealing with this crisis, basic needs insecurity, is 14 percentage points. That gap should sound familiar because it's about the same size as your Black-white gap in college attainment in Texas. In other words, we believe that some of the apparent disparities in college attainment in your state may be due to this underlying issue, which is stemming from students having trouble meeting their non-tuition expenses.
All right, so one of Dr. Golder-Grab's points is that when we think about college affordability, we tend to forget about the additional costs associated with attending college. In many cases, those costs are higher as students live closer to college campus, just because costs go up closer to college campuses, have a higher cost of living. So I wanted to throw out to the group a couple of questions, starting off with how you have personally experienced or witnessed non-tuition costs impact student success. We've got a response already from Ruby in the chat. As a former community college student, my tuition was covered. Most of the burden was food, housing, books, and managing a full life while going to school. On top of that, you need to save money if you want to transfer. So would love to hear other observations on how you have either personally experienced or have witnessed others experiencing the impact of non-tuition costs on student success.
Or on the flip side, if you could fund any support or service to help students successfully complete community college and address some of these basic needs, what would it be and why?
Jennifer says, textbook fees have forced students not to purchase the needed books and struggle to pass the course and or drop out. Kelly says that she can personally name multiple students that have come to her directly with sudden housing issues and their grades have suffered. Their food pantries have made a huge difference.
Hey, Stephanie and Jonathan, this is Priscilla. This is one I'm just gonna, and I agree with all of those, but just to kind of put in context too, because we do food pantries, we have advocacy centers where students can get access to clothes, to food, to helping with housing vouchers, all sorts of stuff. I think what blew me away was that despite all of the pandemic aid we've had, all these things I just listed, that they had to go so far as now put grab and go food stations. And at one of our colleges, they see 450 students utilize that on a daily basis. That blew me away. That number at our downtown, really kind of our downtown campus college just was astonishing, because I knew that the need was there. We'd seen what our students were applying for in terms of aid, what they were looking to pay. But to hear that, to see students as they were going and grabbing those grab and go lunches and meals was also kind of astonishing. So I think that that's the part that I think the commission members have a sense of, but frankly, I don't think they quite understand how bad it is. And frankly, the shame that sometimes our students have in trying to ask for help. So even if we put these services out there, they may not go and obtain those services because they feel that there is a shame associated with going and asking for help. So that is where there's some added other interventions needed at the faculty and advising level to be able to identify and get those students the resources that they need.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And I do want to refer folks, we didn't get a chance, obviously, to share all of the testimony, but there were a number of college presidents who I think spoke to what we just heard and talked about some of the strategies and the needs that they are trying to address for the student population. And I find myself going back to something that to what we shared from Ty Williams, which was, in K-12 education, not only do we have a funding system that acknowledges to some extent, even if it may still have gaps, different student populations and student needs, we provide transportation, we provide food, we provide, some of these basic needs within what we have to work with. But all of those supports basically are no longer provided as soon as that student goes from 12th to effectively 13th grade. So unfortunately, we are at time. We tried to do something very ambitious, and this was our first time doing it. But to close with some next steps, Greg, I'm going to invite you back in for these next steps and our dismissal.
Sure. Thank you, Jonathan. We'll try to do this very quickly. I just want to quickly thank Jonathan and Stephanie again for not only their partnership, but their presentation on today. It was jam-packed, and we're very grateful to have learned so much. And this is just the iceberg. It's just the tip of the iceberg. So we still have so much to do. The commission's next meeting is scheduled for January 18th. So stay tuned for a recap event like this one. We'll be open to everyone. So definitely hope that you will return as we do these brief dives into what is discussed at these often lengthy and very heavy meetings. If you'd like to receive updates from the Commit Partnership on the Texas Community College Commissioners Force, you can subscribe at a link that I'm assuming will be placed in the chat, or at least I hope will be placed in the chat. And then look for the official launch of the Texas Community College Student Advisory Council, which will be coming soon. This will be a group of students, ideally those in community colleges or former community college students who will serve as advisors as we try to make sure that students have a voice at the table, which is absolutely critical, absolutely critical. So I think there is a feedback survey, a quick feedback survey that I'm assuming will be popped up on your screen. If I'm incorrect, please correct me.
Yes, sir. Greg, you got it. So the survey link should be in the chat. Sarah also dropped in a link if you'd like to receive some email updates from the Commit Partnership on the work of the commission. You can subscribe there. And then I'm not going to promise on behalf of any of our other co-hosts, but for anybody who does want to stick around, I'm happy to chat further. I don't have another meeting after this one, at least. If you want to share your feedback live, or if you want to pepper additional questions, or just kind of be in fellowship and reflect a little bit on where we are in the process. So I'm gonna ask that we, I guess, stop recording at this point. Give folks the chance to, again, click on that survey link,